Hello, welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam, brought to you from Nissan Communication Studios. I'm your host tonight, Bill Dixon. Excuse me. Suddenly, about the time I started talking, that frog jumped out of nowhere and got me. If you look on your screen there, you'll see some information that could be very valuable to you. 919-518-9773 to call in, make comments, be part of the show, say whatever you want to say. But even better, we go into Skype to Computers 2K Voice and come on Skype and log in and be part of the show that way. If you want to send me an email for comments or suggestions, whatever, for later shows, Lessons of Vietnam at ncvi.org. Again, appreciate y'all tuning in. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas or a Happy Hanukkah and getting ready for the new year. Next slide. What we're talking about, of course, is the show Lessons of Vietnam. Your show of the Vietnam War and those who served, and and all the things that are going on during the turbulent '60s in America. We're going to help those who remember Vietnam and teach those who don't. We found that the show has helped Vietnam veterans who didn't want to discuss it a whole lot because it's hard to discuss something that most people can't relate to. So by talking with other Vietnam vets and so forth, it's really healing in so many different ways. Tonight's show is Lessons of Vietnam. Say what? And the reason for that, it's not one item we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about several different aspects and things about the Vietnam War that you're going to go, say what? On. And the first one I want to start out with is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is what was used to start the war. The Gulf of Tonkin was when the Maddox and a couple other ships were fired on by North Vietnamese gunboats. There was some truth to that, but again, if you send American ships into a Chinese harbor or any harbor of another country, they probably would send out gunboats too. But this particular incident, next slide, didn't even happen. For those of you who don't remember, there was a gentleman by the name of Admiral James Stockdale. James Stockdale spent time, he was later shot down very shortly after this incident and was held a prisoner of war and he held for quite some time. But during this supposedly incident of the gunboats firing on the American ships, he was actually flying his airplane, Navy flying his airplane, which would mean he was the reason he was an admiral later, not when he was flying his plane. In this particular instance, but he was flying his plane and he was saying to himself, and has actually got records of it, going, what are they shooting at? Because the American ships were shooting back and he didn't see anything for them to be shooting back at. Supposedly they saw some geese or something supposedly showed up on the radar, but they never did anybody ever find any gunships and so forth. But something you need to know before this incident, whether it happened or not, the resolution of the Gulf of Tonkin incident had already been drafted a year before by William P. Bundy, Assistant Secretary of State for Eastern Affairs. President Johnson kept escalating the war because of his some of his advisors. Kennedy kind of got away from listening to the Pentagon earlier because he and the Pentagon had a little disagreement over the Bay of Pigs. So after Kennedy, Johnson came in and he kind of kept that going on. He was listening. He got part of his staff were some of the smartest men in the world. Robert McNamara, who was listed in that group, and so forth. So his 14 senior advisors kind of got him going in there. So that was the Gulf of Tonkin that most historians now say that it never really happened. Now, I'm going to talk about another part of war. Vietnam was not officially a war, okay? The United States has fought two different forms of war. The first one we're going to talk about is total war, and then we're going to talk about the limited war. Now, what's the difference? There's quite a bit of difference between the two. Um, in a total war, you go in and you do everything. You get rid of agriculture, you get rid of industrial, humans. What you do is you go in and try to annihilate the enemy, take everything they have away from them up to the point of them giving in and says, okay, we give up. That's what a total war is all about. It's been practiced from the beginning. You know, it goes all the way back to since there was man and wars, practice total war. Uh, there's a little difference between, if you look back at World War II, the mass bombings of cities and so forth, uh, even though the Americans and their allies did try to separate the civilians from the militants, but at the same time, if they were getting problems from a particular town or whatever, they went in and leveled the town. And of course, civilians were killed in that. Um, World War II is probably one of the biggest models we have now of what was going on with total war. If you look at the Blitz of London, by Germany and so forth, all the bombs and so forth that was going on. Now, in that war, you take land and you keep moving forward. You take the land so that the enemy doesn't have the land. You take their food, you take their weapons, you take everything that you can possibly take away from them so they can't conduct a war. Now let's talk about the limited war. You know, the Vietnam War was called a police action, a conflict, but everything but a war. Now, I'm not certain when you look at war and you shoot at people and they shoot back and your guys die and their guys die, why you wouldn't call it a war, but we kind of call the Vietnam War and the Korean War a police action. Now, even though Korea was called a police action, it was closer to, I believe, to a total war than a limited war, even though some historians have considered it being a limited war. It wasn't limited because that's what brought the Chinese in, was when we went into China too far, and the Chinese got upset that we were going in, and they came back and pushed us almost to the ocean until we finally got some men back in there and pushed them back. So what exactly is police action or undeclared war? It's mostly a political war. In total war, the governments have been out there trying to bring about a total surrender to the other side, as it says there. As we've already talked about, the function is to eliminate their military. Total war is, as it says there on the slide, it's an ambiguous concept and mostly understood by those engaged in the fighting. Well, I can tell you, as a Vietnam vet, I did not understand the fighting in Vietnam. I don't know of too many people who did. The limited war has limited goals. And I'm not certain, even to this day, and as much as I have studied the Vietnam War, been participated in it and so forth, I'm still not quite certain what the goals were for the United States in South Vietnam. It was said that we were there to stop communism, but there was no action towards that. We would basically, how did you tell if you won or lost? Well, if you kill more of the communists today than they killed of you, then you've won the day. But what did you gain? A few more of them dead, and you lost some of your own men, and continued the next day was the same thing. You didn't take territory and so forth. Limited wars imply limited goals. I'm not, looking back, I'm not certain there were a whole lot of goals, like I said, on the Vietnam War. They're ambiguous, and you got to complete, every so often you got to come back in and rationalize why you were there, why we were in Vietnam. That's the reason the Johnson and Nixon would come on air all the time and talk about why we were there, what we were doing, how we were winning, and all that sort of stuff. And you got to completely explain to the troops as well as the people at home on a regular basis that if you don't have goals or whatever in sight, you just have to continue going off and proving why you're in this limited war. And it's limited to what? I don't know. Total war or limited war, unfortunately, it's the young men and women of our country who pay the price for a limited war or a total war. Unlimited war to me is just sending young men out and women out to die without having a real reason for being there, other than just sending there to for political reasons. That's the only difference is the politics of the war. Now, one of the problems along with being in a limited war was the rules of engagement. This is the rules that the young men and women fighting have to follow, which also goes along with the limited war. You go, rules? Yeah. There were lots of rules, and they had a tendency to change. A lot of people look back and said that had we fought the war differently, then we may have come out with a different income. The United States soldiers and Marines and so forth were hampered by so many different rules and regulations of what they could do and what they couldn't do. Officially, we never went into North Vietnam. Up until towards the end of the war, we never went into Laos and Cambodia so all the guys, the communists had to do was shoot our guys, then step across the line and go, yeah, you can't hurt us anymore because you can't shoot over here. We never really bombed a lot of Hanoi. There were certain areas that we knew not to bomb and so forth. There was a lot of bombs dropped on empty rice paddies and so forth. In World War II, the United States fought on two fronts. We fought in Europe and we fought in the Pacific. We kicked butt in both areas. Yet, here we are in a podunk country called North Vietnam, and they fought us to a standstill. Right at 14 years, depending on some people, I should go longer than that, but we'll say 14 years we were there. And we ended up walking away with not a peace or anything else. We basically deserted the South Vietnamese people. Unlike Korea, Korea has never officially been ended. There was a we're going to stop if you stop agreement with North Korea and South Korea, but officially there was never a end of the war. So officially this war still goes on. But in South Vietnam and North Vietnam and the Vietnam War, we just packed up and left the Vietnamese people to continue fighting on their own. And then we reneged on our promises there until the communists came in and took over. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara forbade the Air Force to strike over 90% of the strategic targets it requested to hit. See, one of the problems was the Pentagon didn't decide what was to be bombed. The men on the field that in Vietnam, the generals who were there, they couldn't decide what was to be bombed. The White House decided what was to be bombed with the information they put together, so it was a political thing. I don't know how you can fight a war by people who are not even there knowing what's going on. I don't care how much intelligence you get, you still don't really know what's going on unless you're there and sitting in the White House and deciding what was to be bombed. But you can bomb this, but you can't bomb that. And if you bomb this, you got to bomb it this way, but you can't bomb all of it. You just got to bomb one part of it. It's a crazy way to fight it. The rules of engagement consumed, by the way, 26 pages. 26 pages of what we could do and what we couldn't do. Now, it has been declassified a few years back, tell us what we could do. Let me just read this, because I want to make sure I get this right. American soldiers were under orders not to shoot first, but to wait until fired upon. If a pilot saw a MiG on the ground, he couldn't attack it. He had to wait until it was airborne, because the White House was afraid we might bomb a Russian or a Chinese soldier who was in that MiG if it was on the ground. If a surface-to-air missile launch site was under construction, we couldn't bomb it. We had to wait until it was built so they'd have an equal chance to shoot us down when we shot them. And it just in March of 19. Okay, I think we did you. I think we skipped one. Yeah, nope. You're right. Okay. All right. Trucks and on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, if the trucks are more than 200 yards off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we couldn't bomb them. They had to be on the trail, which is how they got all the supplies and so forth coming down. Had we fought World War II under the same restrictions, we would never have won. We would have lost the war. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, they had all these restrictions, and they kept changing. Some days you could do this, and some days you could do that, but, okay, I see what it was now. I had switched slides on myself and didn't realize I had switched slides. Sometimes they come in and say, okay, you can bomb this place. But then they come in, by the time the airplane was in the air, flying, headed that way, they would change it. No, you can't bomb there, but here's a new bomb site and so forth. It was constantly being changed. Often when limited extensions of target areas were granted, they were unexpectedly canceled and withdrawn shortly afterwards. In other words, somebody at the White House couldn't make up their mind. We're not a great way to fight a war. And next slide. That's the slide I thought I had switched around and confused myself. It didn't take much to do that, but in March of 1968, Science and Mechanics interviewed nearly a dozen retired high-ranking U.S. military officers. Each officer was given a questionnaire or of what was about the war and so forth. And they all come back and said the Vietnam War could be won quickly in weeks or months with restraints lifted. Among the recommendations were declare war on North Vietnam. We never went into North Vietnam on force. We did bomb a little bit over there. We did send the Song Tay raid in, which even though there was no prisoners there, it made a big difference to the prisoners of war. We did have some special forces guys who went in a little bit into North Vietnam and so forth, but we really never declared a war on them. We never went into North Vietnam. It was basically North Vietnam didn't have a whole lot of skin in the ground in the game except the people they were sending over. We never went into the country, never gave them a reason to give up other than so they could take over South Vietnam. We only bombed certain targets. Hanoi is below sea level. Had we bombed the dikes around Hanoi, we would have flooded Hanoi. All you had to do is hit one of the dikes, you would have flooded Hanoi, but we never did. Up until late in the war, we never mined Haiphong Harbor because we were afraid that a Russian or Chinese ship would hit one of those those mines in the harbor and sink a Russian or Chinese ship. Our government was scared to death of Russia and what Russia would do and what the Chinese would do. It's kind of like politics today. The president draws a line and then draws another line and he draws another line. We were scared to death of what the Russians and the Chinese would do. I think if we stood up and say this is like the Kennedy had enough gumption to go get the missiles out of Cuba, but none of our presidents after that seemed to have any guts at all because they were afraid of what the Russians would do. They never stood them down the way Kennedy did. Blockade Haiphong Harbor, if you didn't mine it and blockade it so ships couldn't get in. That's where 90% of the materials were brought in to North Vietnam. Blocked the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That would have been a tough chore, but it probably could have been done and they would have to open up new trails. See, the problem was we would bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh Trail was not one trail, by the way. It was a series of trails, but we'd bomb the trails where the trucks were, and they had civilians who lived right along the trail. We could bomb it today, and they'd have the civilians out there or slave labor out there, and they would go out there and fix the Ho Chi Minh Trail up, and it would be back open the next day. So that's kind of what the limited war and a total war was about. Now I'm going to go into a little more personal situation. And if you were in the military, you can probably relate to this. You'd go, they tell you it's time for your shots, and you go line up and you walk down, and all of a sudden you see this guy standing up with looks like staple guns. This is what you see here is an air gun. Basically, you walk up and usually get you in both arms. One guy gets you in one arm at one time, and the next guy gets you at the same time. You get shot both times. This gun actually shoots the medication into your arm by air. But the problem with that is if you flinch or the guy who's giving the shots is getting tired because he's already given 30 or 40 shots today, gets a little bit lazy and he twists the gun a little bit, it will cut you like a razor blade. And you see guys walking down that line with blood dripping off their fingertips. And you see guys that were normally tough guys passing out just from being shot on both sides with these air guns. It's amazing to see the number of guys that were just falling out. Part of the problem with that, though, is also, if you notice when they were doing it, they never stopped. They never cleaned the heads of those guns. The military today, and the next picture kind of gives you an idea of going through that line and so forth. And it really hurts sometimes when the guy shot the medicine in and hit a bone or something in your arm. Oh, that would jar you. It was like going through the factory line. It was like Ford Motor Company or something. But the problem they have found out today is the military is having a lot of problems with hepatitis C from the, veterans and so forth. And now they've gone back and done some research. It's amazing how hindsight works. They've done research and so forth, and they have found that these air guns, whenever they put that gun to your arm and shot it, that little nozzle picked up skin from the guy in front of you. And then the next guy come along, and you got up there and got some skin from you, and the next guy come along, got some skin. And what they were basically doing, it was never sterilized, and they were shooting any health problems you had or the guy behind you and the guy in front of you. They were sharing it together. They haven't really come out and admitted to this, but there's been tests that shows that hepatitis C does come from guns and so forth. I don't think they use them today because I don't think anybody ever really liked them because they do hurt. And like I said, if you flinched a little bit, there's a lot of blood. Now, the next slide is, if I remember correctly, after the World War II, excuse me, sorry about that. Didn't mean to cough in your ear there, but after World War II, they went to, later, in the last few years or so, they went to some of the islands and found some Japanese soldiers who did not know the war was over with, who had still been on the island for all those years. Well, guess what? We had the same situation in Vietnam. This is a father and son who spent 40 plus years hiding from United States airstrikes. They were discovered in 2013. Now, how did they do, where did all that come about? They were, this Vietnamese, North Vietnamese soldier was in his village, visiting his family. The American bombers came in, they bombed the village and killed almost everybody in the village. It killed the guy's family, except for him and his son. So they went out and hid in the jungle to get away from the bombing and just kind of stayed. His name was Ho Van Thon. Excuse me if I didn't pronounce that right if you speak Vietnamese, but that was what we're going to call him anyway, Ho Van Thon. And his son, Ho Van Long. Now, in Vietnam, they use their last name first. That's the reason it's both of them Ho and Wins, which is a good part of Vietnam is Wins. But that's how his name is Ho Van Thon and his son, Ho Van Long. For over 4 decades, they hid out in the jungles. Didn't see another living soul. They lived as hermits in a remote area of Tay Tra district in Vietnam. And what they did to survive, okay, like I said, he was in North Vietnam Army in 1972. He got out and went out into the jungle, and they lived very primitive. They made their tools and their weapons out of what they had. They made their clothes of what they had. They did some farming for vegetables and so forth. And basically, they ate a lot of rats and bats and other things they captured out there in the jungle. One day they were discovered. Somebody saw them and I guess talked to them and discovered who they were, and they still refused to come in. So they got some of the family members to come talk to them. And here's the son eating one of their #1 diets. He's eating some rats that they cooked and wearing his loincloth from tree bark. And that's him. So as it says here, they were spotted by foragers. That was people going out and finding metal parts in Vietnam. It's a big market for picking up. Whenever the airplanes were flying, they would drop their gas tanks before they bombed. There was different materials, tanks, and there were all kinds of stuff all scattered all through the jungle that were shot down where they collect scrap metal, which is also a problem today because quite often they'll end up snapping on a landmine that's out there and losing an arm and a leg. But they were out there and they saw these jungle men out there. They didn't know what was going on themselves. They refused to come in. As I said before, they went out and got some relatives and brought them back, but they still weren't going to come in. But suddenly, well, not suddenly, but finally, the father, because getting up in age, started having some ailments that they brought into the village so they could be treated. The problem was they had been out there for 40-some years. They had not been exposed to the diseases and so forth they had. So when they did get into the villages, they had a lot of problems with diseases and so forth. As it says there, they drank from they were exposed to all kinds of illnesses and so forth. Now, their son, Ho Van Long, is still not interested in any news from the outside world. He don't care whether the war was fought or whatever. The war was over. That doesn't interest him anymore because he was not part of it at all. He doesn't use electricity. He lived most of his life, 40-some years anyway, without electricity or running water or anything like that. And now he's planning on getting married. And the problem was he'd never seen a woman for the 40-some years. Boy, is he in for a shock, huh? Now, let's talk about another part of the war going. Say what? The M16. The government wanted to make a rifle a little more easier to handle and so forth. I carried an M14 when I was in Vietnam. I thought it was a fantastic weapon. It was heavy and it was long, and I didn't realize just how problematic it was up until I got in the jungle sometimes so thick I couldn't raise it button to one waist high to shoot it because it was just so thick with jungle. Well, they come out with the M16 rifle there. Armalite actually had the first design, but they sold their design to Colt. So when the first M16 started going out to the troops, they thought it was a Mattel toy. Mattel was a big toy company then. Mattel's a big toy company then. Now, the problem was that the Mattel toy company actually made the handles. The part at the back where you put on your shoulder. That was actually made by Mattel and had Mattel stamped on the handles. So a lot of soldiers, thought the M16 was made by the toy company M16, which created some situations that went on. It was first introduced in Vietnam. They noticed the Mattel stamped on it and so forth. They did start taking the Mattel off the shipment, so they quit calling it as a toy gun. It's one of the sayings of Mattel had back then was their keywords were, "You can tell it's Mattel." That was supposed to mean it was a good toy. Had a lot of plastic parts, which does not didn't stand up real well to hiking the jungle and jumping and dropping it and so forth. So it came across, if you look at the M14, it was heavy, it was solid, and then you picked up the M16, it was like it was just a plastic toy, just like Mattel. Now, the M16, a rapid-fire 5.56 millimeter assault rifle carried by 1,000 American troops during the Vietnam War, grew out of efforts to develop a replacement with the standard M1 carbine used in World War II, using plastic alloys which made it lighter and so forth. Hundreds of thousands of M16s were supplied to U.S. troops in the mid-60s as the U.S. Army made the M16 their standard weapon. Okay. The M16, though, soon developed a reputation for unreliability, frequently for jamming and fouling, especially when not kept clean. But the only problem with keeping it clean was that you may have got your M16, but you didn't get a cleaning rod and stuff to go with it. You just got the rifle. Also, there was some other problems. They say the AK-47, which the communists used, you could dig a ditch, throw the rifle AK-47 in the ditch, dig it up the next year, and pull the trigger, and it'll still fire. You could walk about a half a mile with an M16, and it would jam, and that, which was creating a real problem, especially if you're in the middle of a firefight and it jams. It's not good if you're the one that has a rifle. So as it first came out, it had all kinds of problems and so forth. And Tennessee, and that was in 1966, as I mentioned, it had a terrible tendency to jam during the middle of a battle. And what's more is the jamming was often one of the worst sorts, a phenomenon known as failure to extract. In other words, once you fired the bullet, the cartridge would fail to extract. So then you had to get a cleaning gun or rod or something like that, and you had to get back out there and jam it down in there and try to get that shell out. It was kind of like during the colonial days when we had a muzzle loader. You shoot and you got to put the powder in, you put your wad in, and you put the bullet in, you jam it all down in there. Well, the M16, you had to do all that jamming to get it out, which was a real problem. Now, you had to push that metal rod down in there and you had to beat it out. Like it says here, your single-shot musket, as I already said, showed that 80% of 1,585 troops questioned in 1967 had experienced a stoppage while firing. Well, in 1967, we didn't have a whole lot more troops there then. We were just starting to build up a little bit. As far as combat troops, we probably didn't have a whole lot more than that, and each one, almost every one of them had some kind of jamming and so forth. All this time, the United States Army was saying that is the best weapon that has ever been out there. It's perfect for fighting in the jungles of Vietnam. You couldn't ask for anything better. Well, because of the problems kept going on and got so extensive, Congress finally stepped in and said, wait a minute, let's look at this thing. Why are we having so much complaints from the troops? While the Army is saying it's the greatest thing in the world. So they investigated, and they found a couple of things. Armalite, who originally designed the rifle, also designed a low residue cartridge. So when it was fired, there was not a whole lot of powder residue left in the rifle. It also had a special oil and cleaning and so forth. When they sent the rifle out to the troops, they decided not to use the little more expensive bullet because it would cost a little bit more, but the low residue was a problem, was a great invention of powder. So what happens, you fire a weapon and you're in the swamps of the Delta and the humidity of Vietnam, and that residue built up, and next thing you know, that residue of the powder jammed the gun up. Well, then you don't have the rod and cleaning supplies to keep it clean. Nobody ever really told the soldiers that you got to clean this thing often because of the residue. So they went out there and refitted the rifle. They did lots of different things to it. One of the things they did was the original muzzle suppressor, that's the thing on the end of the rifle, had notches in it. And if you look at those notches, the notches got hung on every vine, piece of wood, tree, or whatever in the jungle, so they went with a solid muzzle suppressor. That was the thing on the very end. But they did finally get the rifle, and I haven't heard any soldiers complaining about it today. Armalite is now making the weapons again. It's called a AR-15 or something like that. That's what they call it today. But it's still made, the one for war we use is still made by Colt Firearms. Now, let's talk about this gentleman. This gentleman's name is Pham Nguyen An. Give you an idea just how crazy the war was. The number one spy for communist Vietnam worked for the United States news media. He worked for the news media, and he found that was a way in order to get all the good information and so forth, because he would get all the good information from them. Westmoreland was probably the most open to press general who in charge of the war, of any war we'd ever had before or since. And he would invite just about everybody out to what we used to call the 5 o'clock follies, where they all the war correspondents who never left Saigon and the hotels there in Saigon where the bars and so forth were, they would all meet at Westmoreland's office and get the briefing of what was going on that day. In other words, how many did we kill? What was the body count today of the comments we got? And that was very important, was the body count. And if you didn't have a good body count, you better start explaining why you didn't get it. But this guy worked for part-time for Time Magazine. And at one time he was working for Reuters, but the problem was he kept disappearing for several days at a time. So they would give him an assignment and he would disappear. And they could figure out why he was disappearing. But he became the best Vietnamese reporter of the whole war. He was liked by the Americans because he spoke English well. He got along with them very well. They'd go out and drink together and party together. The officials, the South Vietnamese officials all liked him, thought he was great because the Americans thought he was great, so they thought it was great. But he worked for the CIA. He worked for the Vietnamese intelligence. He worked for all the intelligence of the South Vietnamese intelligence, American intelligence groups also. But all this time he was a spy. He also was in charge of a POW camp. This POW camp was it was called the Vietnam's worst POW camp, and I can't imagine what that was like, because some of them were pretty bad. And for those of you who don't know a whole lot about what's going on the Vietnam War, well after all the American prisoners of war were returned, a Marine by the name of Robert Garwood came back and said he was held captive. And a lot of former POWs stepped up and said, yeah, he actually carried a weapon and pushed us around and worked with the communists and helped and made us work details and so forth. Well, according to my resources, that he was actually coerced, encouraged, whatever you want to call it. Something like a prisoner of war we're having conversations about even today by Mr. Bergendahl. But he became part of, he was a young Marine and was a turncoat for the communists, persuaded by An. He transformed himself from just being a Vietnamese communist into being this superlative guy. He came to school in America and studied journalism. He knew that his people in charge of him knew that was a good idea for him to become this reporter. Like I said, he learned to speak English very well. He was very outgoing and so forth. The Americans liked him. And he could read English great. So it just worked right in for him to work with because nobody questioned the press. Being out on battles or going into the briefings and so forth, and nobody ever questioned because he was looked on by the Americans, so they never really questioned. There was a couple of American soldiers who had some questions, but they kind of kept their mouth shut because they were concerned with their own careers and so forth. They thought that An was probably the greatest analyzer of what was going on and so forth, but it was actually his friend who was there in Saigon was the best analyst, and who he worked for Newsweek, if I remember correctly. His name was Nguyen Hong Vong, and he was a very good when it comes to coming up with what was going on in the war and so forth. Even after he was revealed as a spy, most American journalists still said they supported him. They said that whenever they had a conversation with him, he always was in the middle. He never went one side or the other. He always spoke the truth and so forth. So they, even though they found out he was a spy, they supported him. I guess they didn't want egg in their own face. But his real job all this time was to collect intelligence to give out to his side. He even one of the first big battle of Vietnam was Oppach on January 2nd, 1963. One of the biggest first American battles. He got all the information from Westmoreland's people and gave it all to the communists, so they knew where the Americans were going to be, what they were doing, and so forth. Now, I was there for Tet, and it didn't know it at the time, and I guess the rest of us didn't, but those two men were very instrumental in all the things that went on during the Tet Offensive in Saigon, at the least. They did all the tactical planning. They attacked attacking the TV and radio stations, attacking the embassy and so forth. They went all over town in their French car, and Americans didn't bother them, or the South Vietnamese didn't bother them, because they thought they would just report us out. And come to find out, they were just more than reporters. And both of them got the equivalent of the Medal of Honor for their activities at Tet in Saigon and so forth, which I think is absolutely terrible. But I guess they did what they were supposed to be doing. On April 30th, 1975, another day that will go down in infamy, as the North Vietnamese tanks, actually they were Russian tanks operated by the North Vietnamese and Chinese, came into town and crashed through the gates of Saigon, and they took over Saigon. And you remember seeing the last helicopter supposedly leaving from the embassy. It was not leaving from the embassy. It was leaving from the bachelor quarters of the CIA down from the embassy. But he was actually the bureau chief for Time magazine, and he was sending in reports still while he was the communist #1 spy. He was still, the Time magazine and all the others were still taking his reports and so forth. It just blows me away. Even though they knew he was a spy, they just still kept him. I guess he was still getting a paycheck from them and so forth. Speaks well of some of our news magazines and so forth. Okay, that's a little bit story about him. Let's talk about a North Carolinian. Dan Bullock was the youngest man to die in the Vietnam War. He was probably one of the youngest men to die in any of our wars since maybe World War I. He was killed instantly on June 7th, 1969, when his unit was attacked by rockets and mortars. He was only 15 years old. He'd only been in Vietnam a very short time. He was born on December 20th, 1953 in Goldsboro. Now, at the age of 11, his father moved his family from Goldsboro to Winsburg in Brooklyn. He didn't like being up in New York area for whatever reason, because he was a country boy. Had grown up in Goldsboro with his friends and so forth. So but he always had a dream to be a pilot or a policeman or a Marine. And when he got up there, he didn't really fit in with the school guys. He probably had that funny Southern accent that people think Southerners have, that really don't have. It's the Northerners have the accent. But he probably talked funny, and they probably gave him a hard time because he talked funny to them. So he decided to do something about it. At the time of his death, as I've said before, he was 15 years old. He was at An Hoa Combat Base, Quang Nam Province, Republic of Vietnam. Been a Southern boy. When he was 12, his mom passed away, which is why he was moved to New York. He was determined to do something with his life. He was not happy, like I said before. He used a little ingenuity. and he altered his birth certificate, and he changed it well enough to. He changed it from his birth date from 21st of December 1949 to December 21st, 1953. He got into the Marine Corps. They probably didn't look that close anyway. Then when he got to basic training and going through basic training, some of the guys he was basic training with got the idea that he really wasn't as old as he said he was, because he had some trouble getting through basic training, but it kind of helped him along and so forth. And he got through basic training, and of course, he was sent to Vietnam. The base they was at came under attack. There were 5 men killed. Of that 5, Dan Bullock was one of them. His lieutenant, captain, excuse me, I can't even read my own stuff. His captain wrote the family a letter, and they were talking about how Dan was such a good soldier. Dan immediately realized the attack was stronger than usual and that the ammunition supply was becoming depleted. He rushed to get more ammunition for his unit. He constantly exposed himself to enemy fire in order to keep the company supplied with the ammunition needed to hold off the attack. As the attack pressed on, Dan again went to get more information when he was mortally wounded by a burst of enemy fire and died instantly at approximately 1:50 a.m. And that was only a couple weeks after he got to Vietnam. Today, Dan Bullock is buried in Goldsboro, North Carolina. There's some Vietnam veterans who are down there who helped look after the graveside. He was born, buried there beside his mother and his grandmother. So if you get a chance to go down to cemetery there in Goldsboro, North Carolina, be sure and stop by and give you a salute to Dan. Now, let's talk about the longest held POW. I have asked this question for years, and everybody gives me the wrong answer. And there's a reason for that. And I thought it was Alvarez too until I read the book by this gentleman. Alvarez was born December 23rd, 1937, as a former U.S. Navy commander who endured one of the longest periods as a prisoner of war in American history. Alvarez was the first United States pilot to be down and detained during the Vietnam War and spent over 8 years in captivity. But just months before, that was Colonel Floyd J. Thompson, who was Special Forces. He was captured and endured almost 9 years. And he was part of that was held in the jungles of Vietnam in the tiger cages, as I mentioned before on the show about Dan Pitzer and Nick Rowe. He was held in tiger cages. At one time, they buried him in the ground and starved him and so forth. But he was actually captured before Alvarez. But the problem with that was one of the things I like to recommend is you get his book, Glory Denied. It was by Tom Philpott, and it's a good read. I've read it, and it talks about how bad he was treated and so forth, but it also explains why he was not known as the longest held POW. Going with this part, he was drafted in the Army in 1956. He graduated from high school in Bergenfield, New Jersey. By 1960s, he had joined the Special Forces. Those were the Green Beret who went in and before everybody else and covert action. And during in the book, Glory Denied, they talked about his wife and so forth, and he was very bitter later on during this book, and he came back and said the book was full of half-truths and half-lies. Most of that half-truth and lies was stuff that his wife had told him to Philpott, who wrote the book. According to her, their marriage was not the best marriage in the world. He was a career soldier. He volunteered, even though she was expecting a child, he volunteered for Vietnam, which didn't go over well, of course. And when the chaplain, whoever it was, that came to tell her that he was captured, well, actually, he was missing. They didn't know if he was alive or dead. She started screaming, went into labor, and basically had the baby. she started getting the cold shoulder by other wives. They are husbands, sons, brothers, and so forth were in Vietnam, and they didn't want to get too close to a POW's wife, I guess. But anyway, because she wasn't really a good wife to start with. Um, so she basically took the children and moved in with a sergeant who went to Massachusetts to live. Now, during this period of time, she was still getting money and support from the government because her husband was missing. They didn't know if alive or dead. When her word finally reached her that Thompson was alive, she fought fiercely to keep his captivity a secret. She was now living with another sergeant with the kids, and she didn't want anybody still to know that he was captured. So he didn't get out on the POW MIA family recognition and so forth. Later on, she even tried to get him, since he still hadn't come home after all those years, she'd try to get him declared dead. That wouldn't work. So she said she just wanted to be free to start all over again. In 1971, Thompson escaped and was free for nearly 2 days. This activity earned him the Silver Star. They asked Alice, his wife, for permission to publicize his captivity, but she still refused. As a result, the person publicly identified as the longest-held POW was Lieutenant Commander Alvarez of the Navy, who had been captured 4 months before Thompson. But the military really just kind of went along with what Alice, his wife, had to go along with, and they just didn't go out and really correct it. They could have corrected the information anytime they wanted to, and they just kind of sit on it. And Thompson was bitter towards the military because they didn't go out there and publicize the fact that he was a POW and it was the longest held. So even when he came back, people were saying that Alvarez was the longest and he wanted a record corrected, and they really never did. What happened to him to start with, in March 26, 1964, he was an observer on a reconnaissance plane that was hit with small arm fire, and it crashed. Now, he was unconscious, and he happened to wake up as a Vietnam guerrilla grabbed his hand, was getting ready to cut his finger off so he could get his ring from off his finger. He came to, gave the guy his ring, so the guy wouldn't cut his finger off. He saw no Americans at all for 5 years. He spent that time in solitary confinement in the jungles of South Vietnam. Again, not taking anything away from the guys in Hanoi Hilton, but he was out there in the tiger cages with the snakes, the mosquitoes, the bugs, and everything else for 5 years in solitary confinement. I can't imagine it. They bound his elbows behind his back until they touched, then strung up from a beam, causing such excruciating pain that he thought his chest would split open. For 1 4-month period, he was locked in a cage so small that he could neither sit nor stretch out. His legs were removed, his leg irons were removed for 10 minutes a day. In other words, they had a bar across his legs and chain so he couldn't move his legs. And normally the bars for the leg irons and so forth were made for the Vietnamese, not for the big legs of the Americans. So they had to really sometimes stand on them to get them to be able to lock in place. And of course, that just took out chunks of meat and so forth. He escaped 5 times and recaptured 5 times, which brought in more. Every time he tried to escape, they punished him more. Later, because of the Song Tay raid, he was transferred to Hanoi Hilton. When he first got there, he was put in a cell with another soldier, and the soldier, they brought him in, he was unconscious, and they put him in there, and the prisoner of war that was in the cage with him, or cell with him, thought he was a dead man. He looked so bad. They thought he was a dead man. They were going, "Why are you putting a dead man in here with me?" And then later, of course, he discovered that Thompson was in fact alive, and he helped nurse him back and take care of him and so forth. But you got to be in pretty bad shape when a guy who's in bad shape himself looks at you and says, "You're in bad shape. You're dead." But the whole thing that kept him going, the whole time he was a prisoner of war, was getting back to his wife and family. Now, he may not have had a good marriage when he left, but during this period of time, The only thing that kept him going was his wife and his children and how he was going to get back to them. And when he came back and discovered that she is, in fact, where had spent all of his money, living with another military guy, and lost his children and so forth, he became very bitter. He everything he'd hoped for when he came back as a pre-OW were dashed. I mean, everything he lived for was dashed. He still stayed in the military, but they had a hard time finding things for him to do, or assignments and so forth, because he was pretty despondent. He was into alcohol and so forth. And he later, basically, he died in a room by himself, due from alcoholism, all by himself, because he never got the recognition that he really deserved and so forth. Now, I'm running low on time, and I've got lots of more, so I'm going to kind of speed it up a little bit. The incredibly stupid one, Hanoi Hilton. This guy was, well, I'm going to tell you a story. You probably think that, yeah, he was stupid. His name was Douglas Brent Hagendahl III. Now, he was assigned to the USS Canberra, and it had 8-inch guns, and it was in the Gulf of Tonkin to firing missions. Doug's battle station was the aft ammunition handling room, and I'm not certain what aft is. I think that's in front of the boat, ship, whatever. I never have understood port and so forth, but if you're Navy guys, you probably know what I'm talking about here, because I don't. But they were in the Gulf of Tonkin, and he was supposed to go to his watch, but he decided before he did that, he'd go up and get a breath of fresh air. Now, this is where he started creating problems for himself. He went to his locker, he put his wallet and everything he had in the locker and locked it. So then he decided to go outside and get a breath of fresh air before he went to his assignment, which was down inside the ship. Now, one of the things that the Navy trains most sailors on is don't go on deck when the big guns are firing, because they either burst your eardrums, blow you off the ship, or kill you. But evidently he didn't pay attention to that day, because he goes out on the deck to get some fresh air. And now he doesn't really know what happened. All he knows is he wakes up, he's in the Gulf of Tonkin, in the ocean, by himself, with nothing. Remember, he's got no identification or nothing. Well, then he takes his pants off, and because they had taught him that if you're out there, you need a life preserver, and he got the pants with air, billet and so forth. And then he discovered that his pants had holes in them, wouldn't hold air, so then he kind of floated. Well, about 1800 that same day, for you, not in the military, that's 6 o'clock in the evening, a Vietnamese fishing boat came by, and lo and behold, there's an American in the Gulf of Tonkin with nothing on but his underwear, floating out there in the ocean. And remember, everything he had was left in his locker. When they got him ashore, they showed Douglas piles of materials allegedly written by American pilots who had been captured before him. What they wanted him to do was to sign all these confessions and so forth. And they couldn't quite figure out, why is this guy in his underwear out in the Gulf of Tonkin by himself? I mean, was he a CIA guy swimming in from someplace as a spy? They didn't quite know what it was. So they were trying to get him to sign this stuff, and he got the idea that, they think I'm crazy. I'm going to start acting crazy. So then they decided, after back and forth, that they asked him if he would sign some propaganda materials. He said, "Certainly I'll sign it." They said, "Okay, that's great. I mean, here they are, been all these years, all these prisoners of war have been trying to get to sign this stuff, and just couldn't get it signed by these guys. And here's a guy that says he will sign it, just without any torture, anything." Well, then he comes back with, I'm just a poor peasant. I don't know how to read and write. So in order to get him to sign it, they brought in a Vietnamese communist to teach him how to read and write. But then he couldn't, they couldn't teach him how to read and write. I mean, nothing they could do what could get him to read and write. I mean, they just finally gave up. They couldn't write that confession that he wanted him to get because he was too stupid. I mean, they got him to, they wrote it out and fined to war crimes of shelling Ho Chi Minh, where the city where Ho Chi Minh was born, but he signed it. Seaman Apprentice Douglas Brent Hagendahl III, United States Navy Reserve, commanding officer of the USS Canberra. In other words, he signed it as somebody that didn't exist, but he did sign it and so forth. Now they didn't know what to do with him. I mean, here's this crazy person. They didn't know what to do with him. They shuffled him around, and they finally put him in a cage there at Hanoi Hilton, not a cage, but a cell with an officer, an Air Force officer. This guy's name was Joe Krika, who was there, and they come up with the idea of the American government and the families of the POWs did not know who was captured and who wasn't captured. So they got together and they taught Doug how to learn all the names, the units they were with, and all the pertinent information about the POWs that they could. And he got into a song, and he would sing that song, and he got so he could do it from backwards or forwards. And later on, he couldn't get all the people, so they had to put him out in the yard sweeping and so forth. So then he went to the communists and said, well, I'd like to read more of your propaganda stuff. See, remember, he had left his glasses on the ship in his locker when he went out to get fresh air. So they come back in and said, okay, so they gave him a pair of glasses. Well, he could see things close up. Where he had a problem was seeing things far away. So he was out in the yard sweeping and so forth. He couldn't hardly tell what the other prisoners were doing. So by getting these new glasses and so forth, he was able to see who other prisoners were and get out more names and so forth. And he still couldn't read and write, so he couldn't really read the stuff. So one day they decided to kind of do their dog and pony show, and they said, okay, if you could have anything else in the world, what would you want? Now, the idea was he wanted to go home, and they could say, well, all you got to do is sign this stuff, and we're going to go home. And so he came up with, I'd like a pillow, sir. See, they're sleeping on concrete slabs. There's no such thing as a pillow. Now, this wasn't totally unreasonable, considering nobody there had a pillow, but they just basically gave him up on him, and they're the ones that gave him the incredible stupid one. Because they thought he was stupid, they let him go around the cell block and courtyards during the siestas. Every day after noon meal, the Vietnamese would take a nap and so forth, so he could go around and so forth. He was a prisoner without being tortured. I've already talked to him about the glasses and so forth. So basically, when it come down to it, they were going to let him go, which created a problem for him because the rules were by the officers in charge was that until nobody could go home until everybody went home. And he was not going to be one of those that collaborated and was going to be sent home. So he didn't want to go home. But for some reason, to appease some peacekeepers, or actually Americans who went to Hanoi Hilton to meet some of the POWs to appease them, that Vietnamese decided they're going to let 3 prisoners go home, and he was one of them. So they allowed him to be thrown out of the country. So he was, the communists actually threw him out of their country, and he was the junior of all the prisoners. Ross Perot sent him around, and he remembered 256 names was what was given as how many names he memorized and so forth and back and forth. And he remembered those names, and he got so good at it, Ross Perot actually sent him into North Vietnam during the peace talks there to talk about and tell them who were there and so forth. Now, I got one more. I'm running over time, but I want to get this one in. Who served the least amount of time in Vietnam? Sergeant Terry Buckler, 20 years old, was part of the Song Tay raid. Now, that's when the American troops went in to rescue the POWs at the Son Tay prison. The only trouble was there was no prisoners there. So his entire tour of Vietnam was 27 minutes. That's how long the whole group was on the ground. So all the other troops who went in had been to Vietnam before. So his entire experience in Vietnam was 27 minutes, and that was in North Vietnam. And you remember, we didn't go into North Vietnam, but he was a 27-minute tour of Vietnam. I would have liked to have had 27 minutes. That was our show tonight. I ran a little bit over. Hope you were patient. Hope you got some good information and had some fun with it. There's some interesting stories. There's been several of our shows have been on Joseph Hargrove, one of the 3 Marines that were left on Kong Tang Island. The 3 Marines were kind of deserted. There's been some new information to come out about his story, and hopefully next show, January 11th or the 25th, we'll have an update on that for you. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure and tell all your friends about it, and you have a good night. And Happy New Year.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.